He walked out on me the day before our wedding to be with his ex and told everyone I was crazy now. I'm exposing his dirty secrets. My name is Melissa, 30F, and I was supposed to be getting married tomorrow. I'd been with Jake, 32M, for 4 years, and we'd built a life together that I thought was rock solid. We'd moved in together after only a year of dating, and everything had just fallen into place. He was charming, ambitious, and he made me feel like the only woman in the world. We planned our wedding down to the last detail, and I'd been living in a state of blissful anticipation for months. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. But this morning, everything shattered. Jake came into the living room, looking uneasy, avoiding my eyes. He told me we needed to talk, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He'd been distant for the past few days, brushing it off as pre-wedding nerves, and I'd tried not to push him. But now I could see that something was terribly wrong. He took a deep breath and said, "Melissa, I can't do this." My heart dropped, and I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. I could barely process what he was saying. I asked him what he meant, asked if he was just feeling nervous, if he needed some reassurance, but he shook his head, his face cold and unyielding. "It's over, Melissa," he said, his voice hollow. "I can't marry you." I tried to understand, tried to make sense of the words that felt like daggers to my heart. He wouldn't give me a real answer, just kept saying he needed space, that he couldn't go through with the wedding. I begged him to explain, to tell me what had changed, but he refused, his face a mask of indifference. Then he dropped the bombshell. His ex, Laura, 31F, had come back into town a few days ago, and he'd seen her. He claimed it was just to catch up, but I knew better. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the way he couldn't look at me. My mind raced, connecting the dots, and I realized that he was leaving me for her. I felt like I was going to be sick. I asked him if he'd been cheating on me, if he'd been lying to me this whole time. He denied it, insisting that nothing had happened, that he'd only seen her once. But I knew he was lying. I could feel it in my bones. I asked him why he hadn't told me about her, why he kept it a secret. He just shrugged, saying that he didn't want to stress me out before the wedding. The irony hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd been lying to me to protect me, while he was making plans to walk out of my life. I demanded to know why he was doing this, why he'd waited until the last possible moment to drop this bombshell on me. He claimed it was because he hadn't been sure, that he'd needed time to think things over. But I could see the truth in his eyes. He'd made up his mind the moment he saw her, and he'd been stringing me along, waiting for the right moment to pull the rug out from under me. I felt a surge of anger, a rage that bubbled up from the depths of my soul. I told him that he was a coward, that he'd betrayed me in the worst possible way. He didn't even flinch, just stood there, looking at me with a cold indifference that made my skin crawl. He started packing his things, ignoring my pleas, my desperate attempts to understand why he was doing this. I felt like I was watching my entire life crumble before my eyes, helpless to stop it. I asked him if he'd ever loved me, if any of it had been real. He finally stopped, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "I did love you, Melissa," he said, his tone almost condescending. "But things change. People change. You were so focused on the wedding, on making everything perfect, and I don't know. I felt like I was suffocating." His words cut deeper than any knife. He was blaming me, claiming that my excitement, my desire to make our wedding day special, had driven him away. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was trying to make this my fault, trying to paint himself as the victim. I told him that he was a selfish, heartless bastard, that he was throwing away everything we'd built together over some fleeting reunion with his ex. But he just shrugged as if he didn't care. "I'm sorry, Melissa," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I just can't do this anymore." And with that, he walked out the door, leaving me standing in the middle of our half-decorated living room, surrounded by wedding decorations that now felt like a cruel joke. As I stood there, numb and hollow, I realized that he hadn't just abandoned me, he humiliated me. He'd made me believe that I was his future, that we were building a life together, only to discard me at the last possible moment. I felt a wave of nausea, a physical pain that took my breath away. I stumbled to the couch, burying my face in my hands, trying to process the nightmare that had just unfolded. I could still see the look in his eyes, that cold, detached expression that made me feel like I was nothing, like I'd never meant anything to him at all. The hours passed in a blur, and as evening fell, I realized that I had to start calling people, had to explain what had happened. The thought made me feel sick, but I knew I couldn't avoid it. I called my parents first, barely able to get the words out. They were shocked, horrified, and they offered to come over immediately. I told them I needed some time alone, that I'd see them in the morning. Then came the calls to my friends, to the wedding planner, to the venue. Each call felt like a stab to the heart, a reminder of the future I'd lost, of the man who'd betrayed me. As I made the final call, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a realization that I'd been living a lie. Jake had never been the man I thought he was, and our relationship had been built on a foundation of deceit. I had been so blinded by love, by the idea of a perfect wedding, that I hadn't seen the cracks forming beneath the surface. But now the truth was laid bare, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I didn't know what came next, didn't know how I was going to move forward. But one thing was certain. I would never let him make me feel this small, this broken, ever again. The next day, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and messages. Word had spread fast, and it seemed like everyone I knew had something to say. Some of my friends were supportive, offering to come over, to help me through this nightmare. But others were more interested in the gossip, prying for details, asking how I'd managed to push Jake away. I felt sick, realizing that the rumors had already started, that he was spinning the story to make himself look like the victim. I'd barely begun to process what had happened, and now I was being painted as the villain. It didn't take long to find out where the rumors were coming from. Jake had been talking to people, telling them that I'd been obsessed with the wedding, that I'd been driving him crazy with my demands. He claimed that he'd tried to talk to me, that he'd been feeling suffocated for months, but I hadn't listened. He made it sound like he'd had no choice, like he'd been forced to walk away because I'd pushed him to the breaking point. It was a twisted, manipulative version of the truth, and I felt a rage building inside me that I could barely contain. I called him, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. He picked up after a few rings, sounding casual, almost indifferent. I demanded to know why he was lying, why he was spreading these rumors about me. He just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Melissa, you know how you are," he said, his tone condescending. "You were so wrapped up in making everything perfect that you forgot about us. I was miserable, and you didn't even notice." His words cut deep, a calculated attempt to make me doubt myself, to make me question everything I'd done. I told him that he was a coward, that he'd run away because he was too afraid to face the truth. But he just shrugged it off, dismissing my anger as wedding stress. He had no remorse, no guilt, and I realized that he probably planned this from the start. He'd known he was going to leave, had probably been planning it ever since his ex showed up, and he let me go on believing that everything was fine. I felt like a fool, like I'd been blind to the truth that had been staring me in the face. He'd used me, manipulated me, and now he was twisting the knife by turning people against me. The calls kept coming, friends asking if I was okay, but I could hear the doubt in their voices, the hesitation. They were starting to believe his lies, starting to wonder if I'd really been the one to blame. I tried to defend myself, tried to explain what had really happened, but it felt like I was shouting into the void. Jake was charismatic, persuasive, and he knew exactly how to spin the story to make himself look like the wounded party. He was poisoning people against me, and I felt powerless to stop it. In the days that followed, I retreated into myself, barely leaving the house. I couldn't face the judgmental stares, the whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I'd lost everything, my fiancé, my future, my reputation, and it felt like there was nothing left to hold on to. I kept replaying our last conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how he could be so cold, so calculating. I'd loved him, trusted him, and he'd repaid me with betrayal and lies. The anger simmered beneath the surface, a constant, burning ache that wouldn't go away. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I couldn't let him control the narrative, couldn't let him turn me into the villain of his story. I needed to fight back, to show people the truth, even if it meant dragging myself through the mud in the process. I started reaching out to friends, telling them my side, laying out the facts in a calm, measured way. Some of them listened, nodding sympathetically, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They wanted to believe me, but Jake had already planted the seeds of suspicion, and I was fighting an uphill battle. It was then that I decided to confront Laura, his ex, the woman who had shown up and torn my life apart. I tracked her down, finding her at a local cafe, and I approached her with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in days. She looked surprised to see me, but she didn't seem guilty, didn't seem ashamed. I told her what Jake had done, how he left me the day before our wedding, how he blamed me for everything. She listened, her expression unreadable, and when I finished, she just shrugged. "I didn't ask him to leave you," she said, her voice cold. "He made that choice on his own." I realized then that she didn't care, that she wasn't the one pulling the strings. Jake had made his own decisions, and he was the one responsible for the chaos he'd caused. But Laura had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited the fire that was now consuming my life. I told her that I hoped she was happy, that I hoped she enjoyed the destruction she'd caused. She just smirked, sipping her coffee, and I knew then that she'd never understand, never feel the pain she'd inflicted. She was as cold and heartless as he was, and I was done wasting my time on people who had no capacity for empathy. I walked away from that meeting feeling strangely liberated, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo the damage they'd done, but I could reclaim my own story. I could stand up for myself, refuse to let them dictate my narrative. I was done being the victim, done letting Jake control my life from a distance. He'd abandoned me, humiliated me, but he hadn't broken me. I was still standing, and I wasn't going to let him drag me down any further. That night, I began writing, pouring my heart and soul onto the page. I documented everything, the lies, the betrayal, the way he twisted the story to make himself look like the victim. I shared it online, laying bare the truth for everyone to see. It was cathartic, a release of the anger and pain that had been festering inside me. I didn't care who saw it, didn't care if people judged me. I was done hiding, done pretending that I was okay. I had been wronged, and I was going to make sure the world knew the truth. As I hit publish, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had taken back my power, had reclaimed my voice. Jake could say whatever he wanted, could lie and manipulate to his heart's content. But I wasn't going to sit idly by. I had told my story, had laid bare the truth, and now it was up to the world to decide who they believed. I didn't need their validation, didn't need their approval. I had found my own strength, my own resolve, and I knew that I would survive this. I was done being his scapegoat, done letting him define me. I was Melissa, and I was stronger than he'd ever given me credit for. After publishing my story, the reactions poured in. Some people expressed their support, sharing their own tales of betrayal, while others continued to side with Jake, accusing me of seeking attention, of airing private matters for sympathy. It was painful to see how many people were willing to believe him, how easily they dismissed my side of the story, but I didn't care. I had put the truth out there, and I refused to let him twist my life into something ugly without a fight. I was exhausted, but a fire burned within me, a relentless desire for accountability. A few days later, I received a message from Jake. He demanded to meet, saying I'd crossed the line by going public. He accused me of slander, claiming that I was ruining his life, his reputation, that I was the one playing the victim. The audacity made my blood boil. I agreed to meet him, if only to see him try to justify himself face to face. I wasn't scared anymore. I was done being the meek, compliant fiancé he could manipulate. He'd hurt me in ways I could never have imagined, and I wanted him to see the consequences of his actions. We met in a public park, a neutral ground where I could walk away if things got ugly. He was already there when I arrived, pacing back and forth, his face set in a scowl. He barely looked at me as I approached, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. "What the hell were you thinking?" He hissed, his voice low and furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I matched his glare, refusing to back down. "I was thinking that people deserve to know the truth, Jake. You can't just walk out on someone, humiliate them, and expect to get away with it." He laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. Oh, so now you're some kind of hero. You're just trying to drag me down because you can't handle the fact that I didn't want to marry you. His words stung, but I held my ground. I told him that I wasn't trying to be a hero, that I was simply standing up for myself. He had broken my heart, yes, but he'd also tried to ruin my reputation, to make me the villain in a story where he was the real monster. I wasn't going to let him rewrite the narrative, wasn't going to let him manipulate people into seeing me as the one to blame. He scoffed, dismissing my words with a wave of his hand. You were always so dramatic, Melissa. Everything had to be a big deal with you. That's why I couldn't stand it anymore. You made everything about you, about what you wanted, and you didn't care about what I needed. I felt a surge of anger, a flash of indignation. He was still trying to twist things, still trying to paint me as the one at fault. I told him that I had done everything for him, that I had bent over backward to make him happy, and he'd repaid me by sneaking around with his ex, by abandoning me on the eve of our wedding. He shrugged, his face impassive. Laura came back into my life, and I realized that I was missing something. Something you could never give me. His words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. He didn't care about my pain, didn't care about the destruction he'd left in his wake. I could see it in his eyes, the cold indifference, the lack of remorse. I told him that he was a coward, that he'd used me and discarded me without a second thought. But he just smiled, a cruel, empty smile that made my skin crawl. Maybe I am a coward, he said, his tone almost mocking. But at least I'm free now. I'm not stuck in some miserable marriage with a woman who makes everything about herself. I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to scream, to lash out. He had broken me, shattered my dreams, and now he was trying to blame me for it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I told him that he could say whatever he wanted, that he could twist the story to suit his narrative, but I wasn't going to let him control me anymore. He narrowed his eyes, his expression hardening. You think you're so strong, don't you? You think you're some kind of martyr for going public with this. But all you've done is make yourself look pathetic. No one's going to believe you, Melissa. They all see you for what you really are, a desperate, clingy mess who can't handle rejection. His words stung, but I refused to let him see my pain. I looked him in the eye and told him that I'd rather be alone than spend another second with a man as toxic as him. He could call me desperate, clingy, whatever he wanted, but I knew the truth. I had loved him with everything I had, and he'd thrown it all away. He sneered, shaking his head. You're going to regret this, Melissa. People don't just bounce back from things like this. You've burned bridges, alienated people who would have been there for you. You're going to end up alone, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself. I felt a pang of fear, a brief flash of doubt. But I pushed it aside, reminding myself that his words were just another attempt to manipulate me, to make me doubt my own strength. I told him that I'd rather be alone than be with someone who treated me like a disposable convenience. He stared at me, his face twisted with anger, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But then he took a step back, his expression softening into something that almost looked like pity. You're really something, you know that, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. You think you're standing up for yourself, but all you're doing is making a fool of yourself. You're going to be miserable, Melissa. And when you finally realize that, don't come crawling back to me. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the park, surrounded by the quiet whispers of the evening breeze. As he disappeared into the distance, I felt a strange sense of peace. His words had stung, yes, but I'd faced him, had stood my ground, and refused to let him tear me down. He could say whatever he wanted, could spin his lies and spread his rumors, but I knew the truth. I had loved him, had given him everything, and he had betrayed me. I would carry the scars of that betrayal, but I would wear them with pride. I had faced the darkness, had endured the worst kind of heartbreak, and I had survived. I was still standing, and I was stronger than he'd ever given me credit for. After my confrontation with Jake, I braced myself for the inevitable backlash. He'd made it clear that he wasn't going to back down, that he'd keep twisting the story to make me look like the villain. Over the next few days, the rumors grew louder, more insidious. People started saying that I'd driven him away, that I'd been obsessed with controlling every detail of his life. They claimed I'd suffocated him, that I'd been relentless in my pursuit of a perfect wedding at the expense of our relationship. It felt like I was drowning in lies, surrounded by people who were eager to believe the worst about me. My friends became distant, their support fading as the rumors took hold. Some of them stopped answering my calls, while others offered lukewarm reassurances that felt hollow, empty. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the subtle glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. It was devastating, watching as people I'd once trusted began to turn on me, to side with Jake without even hearing my side of the story. I felt like a pariah, an outcast in my own life, and I could feel the anger building within me, a fiery resentment that wouldn't be easily extinguished. Even my family started to question me, to wonder if there was truth to Jake's claims. My mother sat me down one evening, her face lined with worry, and asked if I'd really been that difficult, if I'd been so wrapped up in the wedding that I'd ignored Jake's needs. Her words felt like a betrayal, a confirmation that the lies had taken root, that even my own family was starting to doubt me. I told her the truth, laid out everything that had happened, but I could see the doubt flickering in her eyes. She wanted to believe me, but the rumors had poisoned her too, made her wonder if I played a role in my own heartbreak. I was furious, consumed by a sense of injustice that burned like fire in my veins. Jake had taken everything from me, my future, my happiness, my reputation, and now he was trying to turn my family against me too. I refused to let him win, refused to let him drag me down into the pit he created. I began to fight back, reaching out to anyone who would listen, telling them my side of the story, trying to set the record straight. But it felt like I was fighting a losing battle, like the lies were too deeply ingrained, too powerful to overcome. The worst part was seeing Jake move on, watching as he flaunted his newfound freedom, as if our relationship had meant nothing to him. He started posting pictures with Laura, his ex, their smiles wide and carefree, their happiness like a slap in the face. It was a deliberate act of cruelty, a calculated move to show the world that he was better off without me. I tried to ignore it, tried to block out the images that seemed to haunt me, but they were everywhere, a constant reminder of the life I'd lost, of the man who'd betrayed me. I began to feel a sense of despair, a hopelessness that weighed on me like a stone. I'd fought so hard to reclaim my life, to tell the truth, but it felt like I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. The lies had taken on a life of their own, spreading like wildfire, consuming everything in their path. I was exhausted, drained, barely able to get out of bed in the mornings. My world had shrunk to a narrow, dark space, a place where hope felt like a distant memory, a fleeting dream that I could barely grasp. But then something changed. A message appeared in my inbox, a note from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd seen the rumors, heard the lies, but she told me that she believed me, that she knew the kind of person I was, that she'd always known Jake was hiding something. Her words were a lifeline, a glimmer of light in the darkness that had enveloped me. She reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there were still people who believed in me, who saw through the lies and understood the truth. With her encouragement, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I began to rebuild, to focus on myself, to reclaim the pieces of my life that Jake had tried to destroy. I started therapy, a process that felt slow and painful, but necessary. I needed to confront the wounds he'd inflicted, to heal the scars that had been left behind. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain felt insurmountable, when I wondered if I'd ever truly be free from the shadow he'd cast over my life. But I kept going, determined to find a way forward, to rebuild a life that was mine alone. I began to reconnect with old friends, people who drifted away over the years, people who hadn't been caught up in the rumors and lies. They welcomed me with open arms, their support a balm to my wounded soul. They listened to my story, offered words of comfort, and slowly, I began to feel a sense of belonging again. I realized that Jake hadn't taken everything from me, that there were still people who cared, who saw me for who I truly was. It was a revelation, a reminder that I was stronger than he'd ever given me credit for. One evening, as I was scrolling through old photos, I stumbled across a picture of Jake and me, taken in the early days of our relationship. We looked happy, carefree, blissfully unaware of the storm that lay ahead. I felt a pang of sadness, a fleeting sense of loss for the life we'd never have, the future that had been stolen from me. But I also felt a strange sense of relief, a realization that I was free from his toxicity, from the lies and manipulation that had defined our relationship. I was free to start anew, to build a life that was mine alone, unburdened by his betrayal. I knew that I still had a long road ahead, that healing wouldn't happen overnight. The scars would remain, a permanent reminder of the pain I'd endured, a heartbreak that had changed me forever. But I also knew that I was stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever to reclaim my life. I had faced the worst kind of betrayal, had been dragged through the mud, but I had survived. And in that survival, I found a strength I never knew I possessed. I was Melissa, and I was still standing. Jake could spread his lies, could twist the story to suit his needs, but I knew the truth, and that was enough. Months passed, and the wounds Jake had left began to slowly heal. The rage and despair that had once consumed me started to fade, replaced by a quiet resolve, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I no longer cared about the rumors, about the lies he'd spread to save face. People would believe what they wanted, and I'd learned that I couldn't control that. What I could control was my own life, my own happiness, and I was determined to reclaim both. I had spent too long letting his betrayal define me, letting his cruelty dictate my story. I was ready to move forward. I moved to a new city, leaving behind the painful memories and the people who had doubted me. It was a fresh start, a chance to build a life that was mine alone. I found a small apartment in a vibrant neighborhood, a place filled with life and color and possibility. I threw myself into my work, found new hobbies, and began to meet people who knew nothing of my past, who saw me not as the woman Jake had tried to paint me as, but as someone strong, resilient, and worthy of happiness. I was rediscovering myself, piece by piece, and it felt like I was finally coming home. One day, I received an unexpected message from an old friend who had heard about the ordeal. She cut ties with Jake after the rumors started, refusing to be part of the toxic web he'd spun around himself. She told me that she'd seen through his lies, that she'd always known there was more to the story than he was letting on. Her words were a comfort, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I'd once felt. We met for coffee, catching up on lost time, and as I sat across from her, I realized that I'd gained something far more valuable than the life Jake had stolen from me. I had gained clarity, a renewed sense of purpose, and a determination to live life on my own terms. The healing process wasn't linear, and there were still days when the scars felt fresh, when the memories crept back like shadows in the night. But I'd learned to face them head-on, to confront the pain rather than run from it. I knew now that I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for, that I was capable of rebuilding my life, even after it had been torn apart. I joined a support group, surrounded myself with people who understood, who had faced their own battles and emerged stronger. Together, we shared our stories, our struggles, and our triumphs, and I found a sense of belonging that had been missing for far too long. As the months turned into a year, I felt a shift within me. I was no longer defined by the heartbreak, no longer weighed down by the memories of a man who had never truly valued me. I was free, unburdened, ready to embrace the future with open arms. I took up running, finding solace in the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, in the quiet moments of solitude that allowed me to clear my mind. I felt alive, invigorated, and I knew that I was finally reclaiming my life, that I was finally moving forward. Then one day, I saw him. I was out for a run, enjoying the crisp morning air, when I spotted Jake across the street, walking alone. He looked different, older, tired, as if the weight of his own lies had finally caught up to him. He spotted me, and for a moment our eyes met. I felt a flicker of the old pain, a brief reminder of the heartbreak he'd caused, but it was quickly replaced by a calm sense of detachment. He was a part of my past, a chapter that I had closed, and I realized in that moment that he held no power over me anymore. He crossed the street, approaching me with an awkward, hesitant smile. "Melissa," he said, his voice tentative, almost apologetic. "It's been a while." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply he'd once hurt me. He shifted awkwardly, glancing down at his feet, and then he finally spoke. "I've been meaning to reach out, to apologize for everything. I was an idiot, and I know I hurt you. I'm sorry." His words hung in the air, empty and hollow, a pale shadow of the apology I'd once craved. But now, standing there in front of him, I realized that I didn't need his apology, didn't need his remorse to move on. I looked him in the eye, my voice steady and calm. "I'm glad you finally realized that, Jake, but I don't need your apology. I've moved on, and I'm happy. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." He looked taken aback, as if he'd expected a different reaction, as if he'd hoped for a chance at redemption. But I had no interest in giving him the power over me. He was a stranger now, a ghost from a past life that no longer had any hold on me. He nodded, a hint of regret flickering in his eyes, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, feeling a sense of finality, a closure that I hadn't known I needed. I had faced him, had seen the emptiness behind his apology, and I knew that I was truly free. I turned back to my run, my heart light, my steps steady, and as I moved forward, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I had survived, had rebuilt my life, and I was stronger for it. As the seasons changed, I continued to embrace my new life, finding joy in the little things, in the friendships I'd rekindled, in the love I discovered for myself. I was no longer haunted by the past, no longer defined by the pain Jake had caused. I had reclaimed my story, had taken back the power he'd tried to steal, and I was finally at peace. I looked toward the future with hope, with excitement, knowing that I was ready for whatever lay ahead. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, on the battles I'd fought and won. I knew that I would carry the scars of that heartbreak forever, that they would always be a part of me. But I also knew that those scars were a testament to my strength, a reminder of the resilience that had seen me through the darkest days. I had faced the fire, had walked through the storm, and I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and unbreakable. I was Melissa, and I was ready to live my life on my own terms, unshackled, unburdened, and free.